why your friend's real estate business will cost them more than they think.
And yours won't.
Let's go!
What is something that you believe in that the world doesn't agree with you on, or very few people agree with you on?
Most people that I meet and talk to about business, they are trying to learn the space as opposed to agreeing or disagreeing. I think most people don't know the space enough. I don't mean to be an expert by any stretch of measure, but we have also learned a lot in past 2.5 years that we've been running with it. But overall, if you talk of climate tech sustainability as a space, what I used to believe 2 years back versus what I've seen in the market for 2 years and what I believe now is a couple of things. One, I think 2 years back, with a lot of regulatory environment kind of changing, evolving, there was a very positive momentum that climate tech is now sort of come of age. The regulations are really supportive, blah, blah, blah. And hence, a lot of people are excited about it, right? Um, but over the past 24 months, past 2 3 years, if we were also just coming out of COVID, so there was that hangover of being more sustainable, closer to nature, clean, all of that, right? So last 2 to 3 years, we are back to our capitalist ways. The world is normal again, for the most part. And I think now people are questioning, you want to be sustainable, but what does that really mean, right? What is the cost of being sustainable to the company? Is that cost really something that you would like to bear?
I think you preempted my question because this term sustainability is thrown around so much that we don't often understand what we mean by sustainability. People like to put in sustainability just because it's a keyword. What is the cost that you were talking about? How do you assess that as a company and how do you deal with it?
So there's no simple answer to your question. Number one, we are talking of environmental sustainability, right? So the first thing we need to understand is that for every industry, environmental sustainability ka relevance to that industry could be high, medium, low, right? So and from, if you think of it from an industry's perspective, right, it's important कि environmental sustainability का relevance would be high for me if the environment itself impacts my industry in a big way, right? So when you think in those terms, uh, you will see that environmental sustainability also could mean different things for different people, right? So for somebody, for example, the sector that we work in, for somebody who is, let's say, insuring real estate property, right? Whenever you buy real estate, you're buying a mortgage insurance or an insurance with it, right? For them, sustainability could mean ki whether your property is located in a place which is prone to flash floods, wildfires, lead to destruction of property, and hence their underwriting parameters should be something else, right? For Nescafe manufacturing or making coffee, it could be, how coffee plantation may be affected, right? So it you have to see whether environment or changing environment has a, what is the degree of direct impact does it have on your business. If the direct impact is not very high, probably that industry is not going to value sustainability too much, right? But if there is a direct impact, then you have to see what that direct impact is, because that's when they'll start looking at sustainability. So, which is why you'll see a lot of financial institutions. The example that I just gave you, a lot of financial institutions are now looking at climate risk as a serious parameter to underwrite risk, in whether they are buying an asset, they are lending to an asset, even in terms of mortgages, yeah, they're insuring assets, right? So it really depends on the industry that you're talking about.
Let's talk about your industry. What is your industry and how are you what is the degree of environmental impact and the direct impact that it's having?
We are in real estate. Real estate is basically all things buildings. Um, residential, commercial, and some which you may not think will typically be covered in real estate, like hotels, hospitals, college campuses, data centers, warehousing. All of that gets covered in real estate, right?
It's very ironical you say you're in all things building and construction. And construction innately is a very, very non-green thing.
It is, which is where decarbonizing it is very important, right? So construction is like 40% of total global carbon emissions, right? And how to decarbonize that, I'll come to that later, because that's again a complex question. But when you were talking about, you know, environmental impact in real estate, right? So we look at climate risk in real estate as the key metric. And when you talk of climate risk, there are basically two types of risk. One is pure environmental risk, which is basically what I talked about, your extreme events, extreme weather events, right? Flash floods, wildfires, the extreme temperature increases, too much rainfall, etc., right? So that is one part of it that creates certain level of risk. The other part is what we call in climate science transition risk. Transition risk is basically to say that as the world moves into a lower carbon economy, um, every business will have to transition to a lower carbon economy as well. And that transition fundamentally has an impact on your bottom line, right? So, for example, now New York has a law which is called Local Law 97, New York being one of the largest real estate, densest real estate hubs in the world. They have something called Local Law 97, which basically says that if building level emissions are over a certain level, there's a carbon tax per metric ton that the building owner has to pay, right? So that tax is a clear impact on your bottom line. आपका पैसा जा रहा है, right? As simple as that. So you either invest in reducing your emissions, right, by getting more optimized energy, renewable energy, heat pumps, optimizing your building basically, or you invest in, or you pay a tax. Clear impact on your bottom line, right? And these carbon taxes, wherever they are, they have been increasing at a really high pace. So Singapore, for example, up till 2 years ago, I think they had a carbon tax of, if I'm not wrong, about $10 per metric ton. And now they have a carbon tax of $25 per metric ton. They've already announced in next 2 to 3 years they're going to increase it to like $60 a metric ton.
How many metric tons are usually involved in construction, or how big an impact can it be? Because per metric ton,
Yeah, so if you talk of an operating building, which is like typically an office building, let's say, think of any corporate office building, you'll be talking about upwards of like 100,000 metric tons per building or so.
$10 per metric ton.
100,000 metric tons in construction.
In operating the building.
Okay.
Construction is way more.
And this is operationally per year.
Yeah.
So it's $1 million charge per year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a big impact on your bottom line, right? And especially in an environment where real estate is so stressed as an asset class, that kind of an impact on your bottom line is significant. So that is the transition risk and that risk kind of matters to everybody, not just the building owner who has to pay it today. It matters to, let's say, a Goldman Sachs who's trying to invest in that building and doing a valuation on their potential future cash flows. If this tax rate is going to keep on increasing, it's a stress on your cash flows, right? It's if bank is trying to loan them the money, they're loaning based on their free cash flow available and their ability to pay it back. So it's impacting your free cash flow, right? So it's basically an additional cost item that is figured in your P&L, which you now need to account for, right? So the question before most real estate companies is, should we start investing long term in fundamentally decarbonizing our buildings, or should we pay these taxes which are at a relatively okay acceptable level today and see where it goes, right? So that's where most of the companies are today in the world.
what is the cost of decarbonization? Because you've already told me that if I don't do it, might cost me like $1 million a year if I'm a basic office building. How much does it cost me to get to that point? Does it cost me too much that this becomes irrelevant?
Yeah, so that's honestly, that's a question I don't think anybody in the world today can answer for you. Because if you see just buildings, 70% of building emissions is coming from construction. Uh, and construction once done, you can't go and change the cement and concrete that you put in the building, right? So that's going to be there. You can't do much with it. Then what you can do is year on year operations. You can optimize it a little bit, right? And 70-80% is scope 3 or construction related emissions. And within operations, there is a lot of innovation right now that is happening on how to optimize it, because you cannot fundamentally make those emissions zero. um, those are various reasons. The first reason, if a building has to operate or any business has to operate, fundamentally you need electricity. Electricity goes back to the question of energy which you're drawing from the grid, right? So unless the government is moving from fossil fuel, coal source power plants, or whatever the power companies are, there's nothing much that you can do with the grid, right? So it's at the very first level, it's an energy transition question, which is where like Indian government is also trying to emphasize on how we can transition to a lower carbon energy source. And they're giving out a lot of incentives on solar and other renewable energy sources, right?
What is your role in all this? Where does Accacia come in?
We basically work with real estate companies to help them do two things. One, to understand how much and where their emissions are coming from, right? Uh, so you go to a large real estate company like Heinz, which is one of our clients, Emar, DLF. You go to any of these large companies, they would at any time have some properties which they are running, their existing properties, some which are under construction. So on both ends, while running a property, while as well as while constructing a property, they want to understand ki emissions actually baseline ho kitne rahe hain, right? And that data you need to track over a period of time. uh, Second, we then help them reduce these emissions. Now, in reducing the benchmarks, see, the space is so new that if I tell you as a commercial office, my emissions are, let's say, 10 metric ton per square feet of occupied area, um, I don't know whether that's good, bad, ugly, because there's no benchmark that exists, right? If you look at anybody's financial accounts, you know it's a service business, and hence a 30% EBITDA margin or a 30% profit margin is a good business, or a 10% is a bad business, or this at 1% or no profit is kind of horrible business, right? And that varies from industry to industry. Because we have had a history of companies, them submitting their financials, we now have patterns out of it. In the world of emissions, those patterns don't exist because people are just starting to try out to track their emissions.
The only thing that makes sense to me in this is that the cab ride I just took here, I got a notification after that you have saved 1.03 kilograms of carbon emissions.
By how?
But again, electrical.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the issue with electric vehicles again is that the electricity that you're producing is actually from burning coal. It's not clean energy, right? So it's a lot is being done at the surface level. Though I completely accept the fact that it has to be baby steps, and clean energy will kind of replace the energy sources that you're using in EVs today to make them cleaner. But having said that, I think it brings me back to my previous point. End of the day, it's an energy transition game, and governments have to play a big role in that.
Let's talk about timing because we are very in the timing zone right now. Why do you think that it was or it is the right time to start the business that you did?
I think from the world's perspective, if you look at the targets that we've been talking, right? If we exceed 2.5-degree increase in global temperature average, that'll lead to 1 meter rise in sea level and all of that. That 2.5 degree, I think UN or World Bank earlier this year kind of gave a report saying that we might be breaching it earlier, 2 to 3 years earlier, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, I think all of us are really late. There's not much uh, that can be done. We should have started like 10 years ago. But I think, and there are two, if you look at investment in climate tech also, there are two schools of thought. Clearly, you'll see um, a lot of investment going into technologies like us, which will fundamentally go with the school of thought that you have to reduce emissions, and that reduction can help you, kind of save the world and not breach some of those marks that we have put in. But there's another school of thought which clearly says, and there's enough and a lot of investment going into those businesses as well globally, which say कि बहुत late हो गया है. I don't think you can save it. It's not reversible anymore. So let's work on building technologies which can help you capture carbon and store it, right? So, and there is a lot of capital going into that school of thought as well. So we are already seeing impacts of temperature increases, humidity increase. There are new and recent reports which talk about it's not just the temperature increase, उसके साथ humidity भी increase होता है, and hence it's leading to new kind of viruses, diseases. So we'll see the impact going forward, but I think this is not the right time. We should have started like 10 years ago, and we're all like at least 10, 20 years too late.
So there's this show called The Newsroom. Usme they have a guy from the Environmental Commission that comes up and says something very similar that we are at a space where we cannot possibly do anything today. And I would like to ask a very similar question to what was asked on the show that, okay, fine, we're all dead in the water, and I don't think anyone wants to hear that. If we had to look at the positive and say there was like even the 0.0001 chance of us actually getting out of this and reversing this, what are the steps that you guys are taking? Since I'm assuming you are the first school of thought, if I remember that correctly. So what are the steps that you guys are taking?
I'm somewhere in the mid in terms of school of thought. I think while a lot of damage may not be reversible, but at the same time, you have to ramp up your efforts to reduce any future damage, because there's only so much carbon capture that you can do, right? Otherwise, you'll have carbon capture plants like landfills across cities and states, right? So you have to kind of continue to ramp up your efforts to drastically reduce your emissions, so that the future damage is not accelerated. I think that's the kind of school of thought where we sort of lie. But yeah, if there is so much concrete that's already been put in construction, there's nothing much you can do about it. That's totally irreversible.
Let's talk about something that is solvable. Let's say I'm to build a new building tomorrow, and based on our conversation till now, that new building has to be a zero carbon building or a low carbon building. What are the things I'm looking at? How do I decarbonize my building? Let's get into the weeds of it.
So you're looking at, I think, the three main pillars to building construction. One, the design itself, right? So when you're designing the building, there's a lot that can do to actually optimize your future energy consumption, energy loads in the building. If you see a lot of how buildings were designed traditionally in India, right? You look at your old forts, palaces, and stuff, right? There's a lot of natural light, ventilation, um, which kind of works in design from the perspective of what's the natural wind direction, what's the sun movement, right? And you design the building according to that.
Like the Vastu.
Not Vastu. Vastu is something else. This is climatology in buildings, basically, right? If your wind direction is east to west, or northeast to southwest, then you align your openings, windows and stuff in a way that you have natural ventilation, right? Or if your sun direction we know is east, it rises in the east, goes sets in the west, then you have enough openings to let in natural light, right? So basically, fundamentally design the building to fit with your site conditions so that there is natural light and ventilation, hence reducing energy loads. So that's fundamentally starts at the design level. Then within the design, uh, what kind of materials you're using, right? We somewhere in the transition in past 5 decades, we moved from more natural vernacular materials, if I just talk about India, to something which globally kind of was symbolic of capitalism, glass buildings, etc., etc., steel, right? Which it's the same building, right? You walk downtown Gurgaon versus downtown Singapore, there's not much difference in the architecture of the building, right? Which is a side effect of globalization. There are old buildings constructed and high rise too in New Delhi and Mumbai, which don't look like downtown Singapore at all, right? So, choice of materials is typically linked to local sources because one, those materials kind of work in that environment, in that climate. Second, also to make procurement of those materials sustainable, right? Today 60-70% of world's building material is exported from Asia, right? Making Asia the world's factory in a way, and that procurement process itself is causing so much emissions.
But given how much population we have now on the planet, not just in India, and given how easy it is to scale these materials or how easy it has been, don't you think it was a natural transition? Because if I'm to use natural materials, maybe I cannot sustain the population as a whole.
Yes and no. It was a natural transition. I think globalization leads to this. But then there is a point in every industry where you need to kind of turn around and say, okay, we have used globalization to scale this, to focus only on scaling. But now do we need to turn around and look back at the quality itself, right? That moment is to some extent happening in the food industry, right? Where we are now going back to saying we need organic, safe, non GMO, right? More natural sources. But earlier it was scale, so we made all McDonald's and fast food and everything that was scalable. But we are now at a point in that industry where everybody is saying that, okay, this is poison for me. I don't know what the hell am I putting in my body, so let's look at what the industry has been feeding me. So I think this is also natural that in every industry there'll be a point where you'll turn around and say that, okay, we've come to this scale, but did we kind of mess up somewhere along the way?
I think that has to do with basic needs versus then when you have the luxury once the basic needs are met.
Yeah, absolutely.
Similarly, with the construction today, downtown Gurgaon looks similar to a downtown Singapore because the downtown Gurgaon is aspiring to be a downtown Singapore. So the aspirational value is such that they're like, okay, if we look like them, that's one step in being them.
Yeah, that's true, except when it comes to climate risk, where these impacts are accelerating. I think safety is also a basic human need, right? And while you may be aspiring to become more developed country and stuff, but if that's sort of ruining your environment, then you need to rethink on what we are doing in different industries, right?
Maybe the definition of a developed country should be like a country that is able to keep itself healthy.
No, I remember there was a very famous urban planner. He once said that a developed country is not one where everybody can buy a car. A developed country is one where nobody needs to buy a car, right? So you have developed your public transport infrastructure in a way that nobody needs a car, right? And I think the definition of developed country that ways probably will need a reinvention.
I think the Netherlands that way is a very good leader
Yeah,
in this with
yeah.
the number of bikes
A
that they
lot
have
of Nordic
installed.
countries that ways because they are also, from a climate risk perspective, they are also some of the most fragile ecosystems, right?
They're also some of the most developed countries in the
That's
world.
true.
So
Some of the
then,
highest per capita
yeah,
GDP, yeah.
that again takes you back to that point that do you have the money to spend on this?
But see, I think you need to, as a business person, I may not look at it in a very long term, but as government and administrators for somebody who's running the country, you look at macros, and you see like this summer, right? I think in ET or somewhere in the news recently, I read that we've lost over a couple of thousand crores in productivity this summer because of extreme heat wave, right? You see ads of Zomato kind of requesting not to place orders in the afternoon, right? It was the temperature right now is so extreme that it's humanly impossible for people to be out there and not fall sick.
I want to grab this
Yeah.
stem of Nordic countries
Yeah.
and very high temperature in Delhi, right? You talk about ventilation as being one of the things that can make a sustainable property. You talk about materials, you talk about energy loads. The weather, extreme weather in a lot of different countries may not allow for all of these accommodations in real estate. For example, when you talk about Canada, if you're living in the northern side of Canada, you cannot live without heaters. You cannot have ventilation inside a home.
But you can design better insulated homes to reduce the electric energy load.
So, what's the thought process behind? Let's say I'm a builder, I'm watching this podcast, and I get inspired, and I'm like, the next building that I build, I'm going to really, really recommend my owner of the building that please do this with your homes. So, what would be some steps in which I can think this through, and what would be like some basic guidelines, some material choices? What?
So for example, if I'm developing an apartment complex, right?
And let's just take India for example.
India, let them, because every weather is different. Um, Now everything is built in glass and concrete, basically, right? You can actually replace concrete or your traditional bricks with a lot of fly ash bricks. You can replace it with their hollow panels which are made out of fly ash. I can show you apartment projects. Vartika has done some of them very well, where in peak summer, if you go inside the apartment, the outside and inside temperature without a fan, without an air conditioner, is at least a 4 to 5 degree difference, right? Just because it's been designed well from the perspective of orientation, natural ventilation, and the choice of materials. That's the level of, and imagine how much of a difference it can make on your air conditioning load, right? So it's a mix of everything. I'm not saying you can fundamentally in today's, I would not like to live without an AC, as with most of our generation, right? I'm not saying live without ACs, but you can kind of reduce the energy load by optimizing the way your building is designed, and that's what we are focused on, because you cannot fundamentally make a building zero emission. A building will need energy, so it cannot fundamentally be zero emission.
So if we had to look at this whole space of carbon capture that you spoke about and start to talk about optimizing your carbon load, decarbonization, where does this whole space of carbon credits come in? Do you guys deal in carbon credits? What is your take on carbon credits?
I think carbon credits or carbon markets as such are a market which needs a lot of regulatory support to kind of scale. The thought that I'm seeing globally is, if you look at most of these regulations, like I talked about New York, Singapore, most of these regulations, what they're saying is, if the governments are saying that if there is additional revenue that'll be generated because somebody is doing higher emissions, and they're going to spend money to buy credits or offsets, etc., etc., then the government would rather capture that part of their revenue and invest in more large scale green projects as opposed to allowing these small unregulated offset projects to kind of mushroom up, right? Which is where the concept of carbon tax sort of come in, right? So if most governments start taking that thought process, you may not have a very big market in terms of like, even if you look at carbon credits today, I think Asia accounted for, I don't recall, $1 or $2 billion of exports of carbon credits, of which 90% was China. India was the second largest, but the gap was huge.
So India doesn't have a regulatory thing for carbon credits yet, right?
No, no. But it exports. It exports, right? So India had a small share, being the second largest, but a huge gap from China. But most of that export was happening government to government, right? Delhi Metro generates a lot of carbon credits, right? So I think a lot of how this carbon credit market kind of evolves would depend eventually on where the regulation in different countries sort of go. But if the government says that we will like to retain the onus of investing in green projects and probably use part of that capital for grid decarbonization and energy transition of the country as a whole, then you'll probably see more of carbon taxes, which is what is happening, which is exactly what is happening in Europe, a large part of Europe, right? So then you'll see more of carbon taxes as an additional source of revenue for the government to invest in such projects, as opposed to private market carbon credits kind of taking off. So we'll have to wait and watch on that.
Anu, you're dealing with clients primarily out of India, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly. How do you, how did you get there? Today, most people starting out, hardest thing as we spoke about before recording was sales. Getting people on board. For you, it was educating people about what you do in your industry, as you said that there is no people come to you to learn. So how do you convert this learning to okay, I would like to work with you or I would like to buy your product? How did you guys go about it?
Yes, so for us, I've been in the real estate industry for over 2 decades. So, and most part of that I've worked in Southeast Asia and India, but a lot in Southeast Asia. So, for me, the market and the industry that I chose was something that I understood very well and had deep networks in. So, I had that advantage going in, right? But once you know that industry, I think if you look at most sustainability teams, or people in sustainability teams, I think one very unique uh, characteristic about them, sustainability professionals, even in like the most cutthroat capitalistic organizations, are also some of the nicest people and non-competitive people that you'll meet, right? They're just naturally very curious to learn about new things, right? So we are basically building out that relationship with sustainability officers to become the trusted partner, right? So we are probably one of the first tools that they'll buy. So if you're able to establish that relationship, that you have deep technical expertise in that area, I think that's where the trust sort of comes in. And I think that's very important when it comes to sustainability and climate tech, because it is a deeply technical space for most industries. So my advice, if you want to translate to that, to people who want to go in that industry, is to actually think of not climate tech as a separate industry, but work in an industry for a few years. Understand, if you understand an industry well, then you can figure out solutions for that industry that help you address climate risk issues, rather than taking climate tech as a category in itself.
Do you believe you have a big share of a small market?
Big share of a we've just started. I don't think we have any share of any market right now. Too early to say that. But no, real estate market is massive. uh, A green real estate market also, like if the regulations are going the way they are going, there are estimates which say that there is about $18 trillion of investment that's required to just do retrofits uh, with real estate to make it uh, compliant with all the regulations that are coming in, right, over next 10 years. So that's a massive market. Uh, I think we'll probably have a big share of a massive market.
Anu, if tomorrow there was you and someone who was just entering the real estate game and you both had to start from zero, what is it that you would know that would allow you to succeed better than that guy who's just getting into it?
Or faster. Faster than
So one just contacts, uh, right? So if you are selling to a Brookfield or a Blackstone or these large guys, typically for you to get to the right person itself is a 6 months process if you can get to them, right? I've been working with these guys for 2 decades, right? So I know a lot of CXO level people in most of your larger, or at least I'll have a first degree separation connection, right? So network kind of really matters, because most enterprise sales are network driven or relationship driven, right? That's one, which is a big advantage because as a founder, you have to first figure out your distribution. You can figure out your product over a period of time, but if you have to build a business, I think you have to have a very clear sense of distribution, which is what most founders kind of don't think enough about. I think that's super critical. Second, just understanding of the industry, right? So if I'm building a carbon accounting software, to understand each and every piece of business of a DLF. DLF is not one entity. DLF is a mix of 10 entities, right? Somebody doing something else, somebody doing something else, each with a different business model. In one business model, they may only do like facilities management, right? Where they don't own the building, they don't have any equity, it's completely separate entity, subsidiary of DLF Limited, right? How do you do carbon accounting for that versus a DLF Cyber City, which is a separate SPV, versus DLF Retail, which probably owns a couple of malls? Just knowing what goes in the industry, how does procurement of materials happen? It's a lot that you have to know about the industry before you start building out the product, right? Which is where I think most pure tech teams kind of lag behind in selling to enterprises in deep industries, right? Like real estate, if you're selling, you need to speak their lingo. It's a very relationship driven industry. If you don't understand the industry, it'll take you a long time and iterations and feedback from the clients to kind of build your product. We also need that, but yeah, there'll be a lot of knowledge and experience on day zero versus somebody who doesn't come from the industry.
what's the definition of long time?
At least I would say, depending on the industry, but if you're talking of real estate, I think more than the time here, it depends on what have you done in the industry. So within real estate, I have spent 20 years, but then I have done design, construction, investments, asset management, operations. I've done like all key pillars that are there in the industry versus somebody who's done like just 40 years of just investments. He or she will not understand design or construction, right? Versus maybe somebody who has done 10 years of doing all the pieces that I've done would probably be pretty close enough, right? So it's about how much you understand the industry from the depth and breadth of it, because climate kind of impacts every piece of your business. It's not just one piece.
Do you believe that your current knowledge, your current experience,
Mhm.
will allow you to defend your market position when it will be at your peak for like another decade or 2 decades?
Not really. I think as a founder and as a business, especially at the pace at which technology is changing, and given the fact on top of that, you're in an industry which is fast evolving, you have to constantly innovate. Like every 1 or 2 years, every 12 months, you have to sit down and kind of take a stock on what's gone in the next 12 months. Where do you see the new trends coming in? How do you need to adapt? I think that's a constant process if you have to build a sustainable business. And one of the biggest challenges of a founder CEO is how to keep that culture of innovation and hustle alive when you become a 500,000 people company, as such, right? So it's a balancing act. No way this will help me sustain.
I know I need you to do some myth busting for me. Or
Okay,
you might be
I'll
doing
try.
some confirmation. So I come from Calcutta. There's a lot of people in Calcutta who are into real estate. Real estate in my head is an old person's game where it's very non-tech, very person to person. There's people who are talking to each other and construction, how much tech can you get? What is the role of tech?
Not going into age comparisons, but I'm not that young either. But if you see, real estate has traditionally been a family business domain, because fundamentally you became a real estate developer if you own land banks, right, which belong to a family traditionally. Anywhere in the world, that's typically more or less large part of the market, except Blackstone, Brookfield, few exceptions aside, right? Now because of that, you're seeing two things kind of happen in parallel. A lot of these family businesses, you're seeing the next generation sort of now coming at the front of the business, right, where the new generation is saying that, okay, I'm entering a business which is highly optimized. I know a typical hotel, my family owns 100 hotels, but I also know that typical hotel will give me this much percent margin. So मैं इसमें young generation is also kind of hungry to make their own mark and show some impact. So what can I do? Because hotel chalane ka process has been fine tuned over decades and decades, right? So, and at the same time they see a technology wave kind of sweeping every other industry, right? So that's when the curiosities and kind of starts looking that, can I bring in some technology in real estate and optimize it further, which a non-technology setup cannot do, right? So which is where you'll see, and this is happening in parallel, where a third phenomena of post-COVID, certain kinds of real estate, office, etc., kind of not doing that great. So people are also asking, in the aftermath of COVID, can we optimize construction cost? Can we optimize a lot of cost using technology, right? So you'll see in past 2 to 3 years, actually a lot of prop tech specific funds have come up, who are essentially, and PropTech also has become more specialized by saying there is one PropTech and there's one Contech, which is construction tech, right? So how do we make construction, optimize construction more versus property operations more optimized, right? So there is massive investment going into this area. For us, the good thing is that most real estate companies are kind of starting out on their carbon accounting journey. So on day zero, if they start out from technology, then adoption is a lesser challenge versus training a whole manpower which has been doing Bekata on books, right? And then getting them to adopt technology. So we come in a slightly different category because it's new functions sort of coming in. But real estate is undergoing a sea change in terms of adoption of technology. It's one of the most archaic industries, admittedly, when it comes to technology adoption, and it's going a massive change globally. To sort of adopt technology and make it more efficient.
And how will someone today who is in India approach someone like you and avail of your services? Or is there someone else who, is there a particular reason you are not currently operating in India?
No, we are operating in India. We just don't. We don't have a large part of our revenues coming from India, and we are not investing a lot in actively marketing in India today, because I just feel that the regulatory environment is not at a stage where it makes it urgent for a lot of players to sort of invest in this. Having said that, we have a lot of clients in India who who for the most part are Indian counterparts of global companies, large institutional. So, by definition, not just in India, anywhere in the world, our clients are top 20-25% of the industry, right? They are early adopters in case of climate risk, right? Mitigation. So by that definition, India generally doesn't have a big percentage of real estate which is owned by uh, institutional owned real estate, right? So, which is where we don't have a lot of clients in India. Most of our revenue is kind of come, but we do have clients in India, and people reach out to us various ways. Like you can go to our website, contact us. A lot of them reach out to me or my co-founders directly over LinkedIn. In today's connected world, I don't think reaching out is an issue at all.
We have spoken about carbon accounting. We have spoken about mitigation. We have spoken about the costs that these guys will incur if they don't take care of the carbon. Everything has been very negative. Everything has been that we are saving costs. Is there a way for me to actually do something positive via this? Is there a way for me to make money if my building, let's say, or if my construction is carbon neutral, carbon positive? Is there any way to do that?
I think that's the thinking which is the biggest roadblock with climate risk. Uh, and I think that is the thinking which kind of needs to, people are looking at immediate monetization. Climate risk mitigation is a um, long term investment, depending on what you're investing in, right? So if you're investing in energy management systems of some sorts, you've seen their ROI is shortened to 3 to 5 years now. Yeah. Some systems can be as short as 1 to 3 years. So not really long payback periods now. But depending on what you're investing in, right? And that is why our clientele, as I said, is top 20-25% of the industry, because we are not actively going and selling to somebody who is to be convinced that you should do something for climate risk mitigation. We are selling to people who are convinced that they have to do something for climate risk mitigation. They have budgets set aside for that, and we are giving them solutions.
So you're basically skipping the whole education part.
No, we are educating on how to do that.
No,
Sure, on the need to. On the need to. Like the fact that today you go to a real estate company and be like, oh, did you know the amount of impact that you're having? And like you're skipping that whole part and you're being like, they already know the impact they're having, they're looking to reduce the impact. That's where I come in.
Yeah, because see, a big part of the reality is also that I can do a lot of that education not one on one. I can do it through forums, podcasts, and all of that. Uh, but the need assessment is either an internal process, right? As an organization, you take a call on that, or it is coming as a push either from the government, from your investors, from your tenants, right? A third source, which is not me, right? I can try and convince you that from tomorrow you shouldn't be wearing shoes because wearing shoes is harmful for Mother Earth, and long term you're doing a lot of damage, right? There is no way I can convince you to not wearing shoes unless the doctor comes and tells you कि कल से आप जूते पहनोगे तो आपके पैरों में ये लॉन्ग टर्म कुछ हो जाएगा, राइट? और somebody tells you that you'll have a penalty of 5 rupees every time you wear shoes for half an hour, right? I can do whatever I want, but I'll not be able to convince you. I can educate you on the benefits of wearing or not wearing shoes, but I cannot push you to generate that need.
I think we'll take the burden of education.
We do a lot of education on how to reduce, because even when CEOs kind of take a call that okay, this is something we need to focus on, or it comes as a mandate from your investors or your tenants or the governments, there's just not enough stuff out there for people to know what should I do now, right? That's where we go for education, because then the education is very tangible, outcomes driven.
Do you think carbon tax will become a real problem in India?
I think so.
Do you think there's another option for India?
I don't think so. Because I think eventually the government needs to invest in energy transition. Um, Forget everything else. Energy transition is a must. Uh, what's that horizon? I think we'll have to see. But I think energy transition for any economy is a must. And government will need to invest it. And where does that investment come from? There has to be some additional revenue source.
What would be a genuine opinion or a very, very, how in Hindi we say upri upri opinion? Because I know, of course, you won't be the go to source for this. But when there are water checks at factories, people don't even check water, they go to the offices and there's a bag that is like passed on to the authorities with money. Don't you think it'll just become another source?
That is something which is a bigger problem with Indian society than climate change, right? So, that in any case, we need to address, right? I'm not saying that that doesn't need to be addressed. I mean, if you look at the current tax base, people like you and me who are taxpayers, uh, we pay such high rates of taxes, and still the budget is always constrained for the country to make significant investments in different areas that they want to invest. That 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 is anyways a problem, right? And the government has been trying different things to improve the tax base, to bring in more transparency. So that's an ongoing process, but that cannot be an excuse to not have policies in place, right? There's a difference between non-existent existence of a policy versus execution being weak, right? Or execution having loopholes. Once you have the policy, then you start working on how to make the execution watertight. But to begin with, having a policy itself is a big step.
We have a tradition on our podcast. So the last guest has left you a question,
Oh my god.
and we would like you to leave a question for the guest that comes
Okay.
on next. The question we have for you is, when scaling a company, when nothing is working and everything is falling apart, how do you ensure that your team is motivated? And how do you ensure productive output?
I think as a founder, being a founder is a very lonely job, right? As a founder, you are also regulating and balancing the communication with the team, right? So not everything that is going on in your mind does has to be translated in the same way to the team. I think as a founder, you kind of need to be always sort of positive in front of the team and do a lot of solutioning, uh, be more solution focused. So it's the curse of being a leader, right? But at the same time, you want your team to have inputs on things, because you can't do a lot of solutioning without the team. So it's a mix of how do you communicate with the team. Like if I have to try something new because I know the previous thing is not working, I would probably not say it is not working, and say that okay, we should run this little experiment because I see more growth opportunity here, and let's try this out, blah blah blah, right? It's a matter of communication, not be transparent, but at the same time you have to keep the team motivated. So you have to regulate your communication.